Let's start off at number 10 with the teenager who you saw in the intro. Well, that was Conrad Shafer, who was sentenced to life in prison for a double fatal shooting spree that he went on back in 2013. He was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, but in 25 years he is entitled to have his sentence reviewed and it could be shortened. Something tells me that we shouldn't shorten this teenager's sentencing.
My family and I had no intention to forgive the guilty because of such a heinous and brutal crime that was done to my grandson.
This teen went on a murdering spree, killing as many people as he could, but for some reason he's asking for leniency. I mean, buddy, did you give leniency to all the people that you gunned down? So he asked for leniency, pleading that he is sorry for what he has done.
I know if I was in your position, I'd feel the same way. I was 15 at the time, and I'm really sorry for the things I've done. And I know I did wrong, and I know my apology don't mean nothing to you. I know it ain't gonna change how you feel about me, but I just feel like I need to apologize, and I really am sorry for what I've done.
Yeah, I'm totally not buying it. The guy looks like he has no emotions whatsoever on his face. I mean, you ain't sorry. Alright, moving on this list, at number 9, we have 2 best friends, Ricky Jackson and Willie Bridgeman. And they were arrested at the age of 16 years old for a murder that took place in Cleveland, Ohio. Harold Franks was the victim. Well, he was attacked with acid and he was shot twice with a .38 caliber gun. Both teenagers received the death penalty back in 1977, but it was later turned over to life in prison.
Yes. It was young Vernon's testimony that put Jackson on death row.
I could halfway accept my punishment if I was guilty, but, excuse me.
This story takes a huge turn because after spending 40 years behind bars, a judge released them, and the judge said they actually have the wrong people. Ricky and Willie were convicted after a false testimony that was given by a 12-year-old boy. These 2 friends didn't commit the crime, so for the past 40 years they were serving time for someone else's crime. Their lives has been taken away from them.
Words can't express how I feel right now. I'm just glad to be out, glad to be a free man.
What are you going to do? Where are you going to go?
Wow. I mean, you know, you sit in prison for so long, you think about this day, but when it actually comes, you don't know what you just want to do something, you know?
This guy missed out on school, getting his first job, finding a wife, having kids. Being a teenager, you get to experience a lot of things in life, and it is a very important and crucial time in someone's life. Number 8, we have Howard Christensen. He is a Chicago native who became the nation's longest serving prisoner before he finally completed his time. At the age of 17 years old, Howard committed murder and was given a life sentence without parole to 200 years in prison. But that was later overturned to a 64-year prison sentence, which is pretty much life in prison. While Howard actually outlived his prison sentence and was able to see the light of day. Well, just for a few years. Howard was 79 years old when he was finally released. Howard was only able to live 2 years as a free man before he passed away. Moving right along here, we have Bobby Bostic, and he comes onto our list at number 7. Bobby was just 16 years old when he was convicted of committing 17 crimes. Some of them include robbery and kidnapping. He fired a gun at 2 people. While he has been in prison for more than 20 years now, he is now in his 40s. Bobby on our list has one of the longest prison sentences. He was actually sentenced to 241 years. Many people believe that this was way too harsh for this crime. Murder was not committed, although there was near death. Back in 2010, the Supreme Court decided that their initial decision was unconstitutional and minors should have the opportunity to demonstrate maturity and rehabilitation. Even with that though, Bobby won't be eligible for parole until he's 112 years old. So if somehow he's able to outlive that, he has a chance of being a free man one day. Let's talk about a case I've paid close attention to. I've been very fascinated with it. Well, at number 6, let's talk about Brendan Dassey. Probably sounds familiar to you guys. I talk about him a whole lot. Well, he's a nephew of Stephen Avery, the guy from Making a Murder documentary. It's on Netflix.
How you doing, buddy?
Good.
Then they sat down with Brendan. Brendan's lawyers say investigators took advantage of him. Then just 16 years old and with a low IQ, manipulating him into making a false confession.
Brendan Dassey was just 16 years old when he was convicted of first-degree murder and second-degree assault mutilation of a corpse. I believe Brendan Dassey is innocent and was framed. He was sentenced to life in prison with the earliest possibility of parole in 2048. So that's when Brendan Dassey turns 58 years old. Right now he's 28 years old. Stephen Avery, his uncle, is also still in prison, and he has served 18 years for a crime he never committed. He was released, but then he was sentenced again for a new crime, and I don't believe he committed that either. I think he was framed by the same people who convicted him wrongly the first time. So in total, Stephen Avery has been in prison for 30 years, and you know what, I can't wait for season 2 of Making a Murderer to be released on Netflix because I need answers. And actually at number 5, let's talk about Stephen Avery a little bit more. He was also a teenager when he was first in prison. Stephen was 18 years old when he was convicted of assault and attempted murder, and this was back in 1985. Like I said, after 18 years and after DNA testing became more available, it was proven that Stephen Avery was actually the wrong guy and evidence was tampered with by local police. He was serving a 30-year sentence.
Back home, relatives waited patiently. After 18 years, the last few hours were the longest, until finally, the reunion.
Too long ago, too long ago. Oh God, I love you, baby.
Stephen Avery was only free for a few years until he was convicted for a murder. This was back in 2007, and he was given a life imprisonment sentence.
They keep on trying to do something with me. They're trying to find ends. They don't believe none of us. You know, whatever we say, they just don't. We're all liars.
And next up, number 4, we have 65-year-old Wilbert Jones, who was just 19 years old when he was sentenced to prison. He served 46 years for a crime that he didn't even commit. His conviction was just recently overturned. Back in 1971, Jones was found guilty of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a nurse in Louisiana. Apparently, authorities withheld evidence that could have exonerated Jones decades ago. I think this man should have been rewarded millions of dollars, although money won't give his life back. The state of Louisiana took away this man's life. I would be super upset in this situation, but for some reason Jones, he's just thankful for being free.
No, I forgave. You know what I'm saying? I forgive. Because the Lord God knows who's been in my life. I don't have no bit in my life. I gotta go the rest of my life.
Number 3, we have James Robertson, who actually inspired a new documentary on Netflix called I Am a Killer. I'm currently watching it and it's really good. I don't know why I'm so interested in these topics, but they just fascinate me. And I swear, if I wasn't a YouTuber, I'd want to get into criminal psychology or work for Netflix and create these documentaries. James Robertson has had a whole life of crime. He was just 16 years old when he was sent to prison, but his crime started at a much younger age. He grew up with a family that are alcoholics and abusive. Robert is currently in prison for a crime he committed back in 1980, and it was for theft. He has been in prison for the past 37 years. For 20 of those years, James Robertson was left in solitary confinement because he was hard to deal with. So for 23 hours in the day, he's stuck in a very tiny dark room. He doesn't get much visitations. Actually, I don't think he's allowed them at all. Barely no sunlight. And when he does get out of his cell for 1 hour a day, he's in another small cage outside. So James couldn't take this anymore, so he decided to kill his new cellmate, who was a pedophile, because he wanted to be placed on death row. I mean, is this real life right now? While on death row, the rules are different. You actually get a bed to sleep on, you actually get more food to eat, you get medical care. Also, James didn't want to be in prison while he was older because he said, well, he's just going to become an easy target for people to beat up. So he just wants to leave the world. So crazy, because he was just trying to fight for the death penalty, but it took him a long time to actually get it, this is a very unusual request. Number 2, we have Joseph Lagan, who was just 15 years old when he was convicted of murdering 2 people back in 1953. Well, it's been 63 years since he was first sentenced to prison. Currently, Joseph is about 80 years old, and he has spent most of his life in a Philadelphia prison. He actually made it into the news a few years ago because he was given the chance of parole, but he turned it down. Joseph rejected this deal out of principle. He claims that he didn't kill anyone. It's really sad, and you know what? There are thousands of innocent people who are in prison serving times for crimes they didn't commit, and Joseph is probably one of them. Why would he choose to continue to fight for his innocence even when he could be released from prison? So now he is the longest serving juvenile lifer in the world that has been documented. And finally, we have made it to number 1. We have Paul Guidel Jr. And he is known to have served the longest prison sentence in the United States. Back in 1911, Paul was convicted of second-degree murder at the age of 17 years old. When Paul was released from prison, he was 86 years old, meaning he was in prison for 68 years. He was locked away in many different New York State prisons. Paul lived to see the day when he was actually released from prison. When Paul was paroled from prison, he didn't want to leave because that was the only life that he knew. He would probably go into shell shock because the world, it just changes so fast. He was in prison from 1911 to 1979. So let me tell you guys quickly what was invented during that time. So just to name a few, we had radio broadcasting, helicopters, microwaves, ovens, credit cards, widescreen cinemas, videotape recorders, video games, man went to space, computers were a new thing, and I mean all of those things. If you lived in prison, you probably never had any access to any of them. I don't even know if you get newspapers or if you read about it. A new computer, well, what is that? But if you get released into the new world, it can be very confusing. Number 10.
I need to kill Oscar. Actually, I really didn't. I really think I did that. I didn't mean to hurt him.
That was 17-year-old Dylan Shymaker, who fatally beat his girlfriend's 23-month-old son. I mean, is this real life right now? I watched videos about this kid's case, and his lawyers were trying to justify that Dylan has an anger problem. He didn't mean to kill the 23-month-old baby. He didn't know how to control himself. I'm not sure why there are lawyers defending people like this, you know, defending killers. That little baby didn't have a chance at life. What is his lawyers thinking? What are they fighting for?
But there were other dynamics at work there, including my client's inability to either control his anger or frustration and his inexperience in babysitting.
So this took place in Buffalo in the States, and jurors convicted Dylan of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 15 years to life in prison, which is the maximum punishment in Buffalo. Alright, number 9. This right here is Alyssa Bustamante, and she wrote in a diary, and I quote, "I don't know how to feel at the moment. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the oh my god, it's pretty enjoyable. Is this real life right now? Well, hopefully prison is just as enjoyable because you're gonna be calling that place home for a very long time." She's in there after she committed a murder. Bustamante was raised by her grandparents because her mother had a history of drug and alcohol abuse, which led to charges and jail time, and her father was also in jail. He was in jail for assault, so I guess Alyssa didn't fall too far from the apple tree because she's in prison for life for murdering her 9-year-old neighbor just for the thrill of it. Well, she wrote this: "I just effing killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel at the moment. It was kind of amazing." Then she wrote, "I'm kind of nervous and shaky though right now. Okay, I gotta go to church now. LOL." Well, hopefully this teen can have all the time that she needs to, you know, think about her behavior in prison. I think we should give her the rest of her life. Like, give her all the time she needs. From there, let's go to number 8. This is 17-year-old Adrian Zelimer, who pleaded guilty to murdering a 10-year-old girl who was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after 40 years. This came after a plea deal. The 17th Judicial District Attorney Dave Young said this: "In 27 years as a prosecutor, I've never seen a 15-year-old commit such a violent act. This attorney must have seen a lot in his days, especially if he's listening to murder cases all day. And for the attorney to come out with a statement like this is insane. How does a 15-year-old even have it in them to, you know, commit such an awful crime?" At number 7, we have Russell Burrell, who pleaded guilty to a murder. He was alongside 3 other people who committed the murder, and he was sentenced to 6 life sentences in prison plus 10 years. He was the teen we talked about in the intro of this video. Burrell murdered 3 people: Shamika Barris, Michael Martin, and Damian Collin. This was a planned murder in order to steal money and drugs.
Let us be clear, 19-year-old Russell Burrell, who was a juvenile at the time of the murders, was the one who emptied 17 rounds into 3 human beings, and today was his last day in civilized society for the rest of his natural life.
Alright, number 6. We have Shane Thompson, who was 17 years old at the time he committed murder, while he was sentenced to 110 years in prison.
Thompson pleaded guilty to murdering 39-year-old Evelyn Njai during a September 25, 2013 robbery attempt at this Rickers BP located on West 38th Street.
So that wasn't the only crime he committed. He was charged and convicted of murder, robbery, and assault.
Prior to that, Thompson broke into the home of this woman and assaulted her while her husband and sons were held at gunpoint.
This is so sickening, it's hard to even read this. This teenager deserved every moment of that 110 years prison sentence. Thompson is obviously not a normal person. When he was sentenced, he seemed pretty happy about it.
Oh, the man he killed, Derek Thomas, has that story.
Why is this guy smiling? Number 5.
17-year-old Raceland Martin entered the courtroom handcuffed with his feet in shackles. He sat and appeared to be listening intently to testimony, occasionally nervously looking.
That was 17-year-old Raceland Martin, who murdered his grandfather with a hatchet. Martin was 15 years old when he planned the murder of his grandfather. When this kid was in court, he was shaking like crazy.
The defense, however, arguing his client did not have a normal upbringing, functioning as an adult when he should have been treated like a child.
I don't know if you guys saw that, so let's take a look again.
As an adult when he should have been treated like a child.
Why is this teenager scared now? Martin received a life sentence and he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars. He has a chance of setting the record for being the longest serving inmate in prison because he committed an awful crime at such a young age. And he's not getting out until he passes away in prison. So let's see if he can set the record. Number 4, we actually have someone else who killed an elderly person. This right here is 17-year-old teen who murdered 98-year-old Margaret Douglas. She was in her home when the incident happened, and the teenager tried to hide her body in the closet. In court, he tried to apologize for what he did.
I'm so sorry for what I did. I constantly live in regret and shame because of it.
It's been 9 months since these hands committed those acts on...
The only reason why the teen is apologizing is because his lawyers told him to, in an attempt to get a reduced sentencing. But luckily, it never worked. Those fake tears, the words did nothing for him. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 3, we have Savon Shmush, who pleaded guilty to killing his half-sister. Shmush was only 16 years old at the time when he murdered her in their home. He murdered her and dumped her body near a lake so no one can find out. He tried to get away with the crime.
Photos of her smiling face and memories. A young life taken away at the hands of a half-brother who her family says she loved.
He was convicted and sentenced up to 100 years in prison, so because he took a plea deal, he does have a chance of being released from prison when he's 116 years old. This teen has no sympathy whatsoever, so you know what, why should we? If you can live to 116, then we'll let you out. No problems there. In court, he was asked if he has anything to say, and he just said no. Number 2.
Sharing their thoughts with the teenager who admitted to it all, Aiden Von Grabo.
How do you wish to plead to count 2? Guilty, Your Honor.
Von Grabo taking a guilty plea for first-degree murder and a long list of other crimes, including attempting to murder Michaela's younger sister.
Why is this teen so evil? This took place in northern Colorado, and the teen was given life in prison. The person he murdered was Michaela Grote, who was just 20 years old. And apparently she wasn't the only one on his death list that he created. I mean, what the heck is that? He had intentions of killing many more people. He was only 16 years old when he was charged with first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, attempted first-degree arson, extortion, 2 counts of felony menacing, 3 counts of stalking, third-degree assault of an at-risk person, criminal mischief, and telephone harassment. I mean, that is a mouthful to go through. It's just unbelievable that one person, and I should say not just one person, one teenager was capable of doing. Finally, number 1.
Buffalo teen who killed a man and then set his house on fire to cover up the crime is heading...
Next, we're talking about a 19-year-old kid who spent 20 years to life in prison. He was convicted of murdering 15-year-old Brian Dombick.
19-year-old David Myers may very well spend the rest of his days in a prison cell. He spoke before his sentence, apologizing to his victim's family and his own.
If I could go back and make up for what I did, I would. I'll give Harmon a lake.
This might be one teenager who actually felt sorry for what he has done and is willing to deal with the consequences.
I agree. I do deserve to be incarcerated. I committed a crime, and that's all.
Okay, so starting us off like we always do with number 10.
By Judge Rebecca Dallett, who gave him life without parole, sparking the outburst.
So that was 19-year-old Sandell Jackson, who appeared in front of a Milwaukee County Circuit judge who was sentencing him. Sandell was charged with first-degree intentional homicide and attempted robbery in the shooting death of a 21-year-old. Sandell pleaded guilty to the felony murder charges. He was given a life sentence, but was hoping for a chance at parole at some point of his sentencing, but the judge denied it, and that's when Sandell started to freak out. And everyone else in the courtroom was freaking out as well. Moving into number 9, we have this girl who freaked out after she was given a life sentence. She was hyperventilating like So just before the panic attacks were happening, this girl fell to the ground and she started yelling in the courtroom. The woman's family was also freaking out. Alright, number 8.
I gotta wake up every day with that. So, just ask. Actually, I'm just sorry.
I know it's hard to understand what this kid is saying, but he's begging for forgiveness. It's a hard video to watch. I know people make mistakes, but killing someone isn't something that society can forgive, or can they?
John, is there anything you want to say before sentencing?
Well, that was 17-year-old John Freeman, who was saying sorry to the victim's family after he strangled a 5-year-old girl to death. I mean, in that moment, was he really sorry? This also took place near Buffalo, and he was given 25 years to life, and this is for a second-degree murder in which John Freeman pleaded guilty to. So when John turns 42 years old, a judge will determine whether or not John is a danger to himself or to society, and if he's going to be released. Hopefully, if he is released, he's a changed person. There are also many people who have served a number of years to life who just don't get released from prison because they're just always deemed as a danger to society. So although you get like 15 years to life, you can serve like 50 years. Alright, moving into number 7, we have this. You couldn't see the guy I'm talking about during this part of the video, but who you're about to see is 19-year-old Dexter Johnson, who is 19 years old at the time, so he raged out in court when he was given the death sentence. I guess he has nothing else to lose. This is what this guy looks like.
Punishment of death. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is going to complete your jury service. I'm going to meet you in the jury room.
All rise.
The jurors convicted Dexter Johnson of capital murder. Dexter was involved in a carjacking, robbery, rape, and murder of 23-year-old Maria Paris. Dexter is now 28 years old and he's still on death row. And right now he does not have an execution date. Although someone is given the death penalty, it takes a very long time to go through the whole process. Do you guys believe in the death penalty? Sound off in the comment section. At number 6, we now have teenager Samantha Grigg, who was charged for murdering a Michigan State University student Dustin Frolka.
Grigg pleaded guilty to unarmed robbery and manslaughter in Frolka's death. The 19-year-old's body was found along I-69 last February. He had been beaten with brass knuckles, robbed.
This case just doesn't seem to make sense to me. 16-year-old Samantha at the time decided to plan a kidnapping to rob and kill Frolka. I mean, she's 16. How do you have these thoughts? She had someone help her as well, and that was 18-year-old Tyrell Bredernitz. So the reason why this doesn't make sense, because it does seem like Samantha had a really bright future. She threw it all away. She was actually a lead singer of her band, and she was actually quite good.
Singer in a band.
Number 5, we have this teenager who, after given his sentencing, turned around and just attacks the people in the first row. I think it was the victim's family.
No, Your Honor. Nothing, thank you.
Yeah, luckily the police was right there to get on top of the situation, to handle the situation before anyone got hurt. All right, number 4.
Can't, they understand the seriousness of the crime.
Barbeau will almost certainly start his prison sentence at the Department of Corrections, Lincoln Hills School for Boys, north of Wausau.
That was 15-year-old Antonio Barbeau at the time of his trial. This one is pretty messed up, but he was given a life sentence for killing his great-grandmother back in 2012. He was just 13 years old. Antonio and his friend killed his great-grandmother with a hatchet and a hammer. The great-grandmother was 78 years old, and this is just so sickening. Antonio won't be eligible for release until he's 50 years old. The article I was reading about this stated that Antonio's lawyers said the punishment was cruel and unusual. I mean, are they freaking kidding me? There's no way that the lawyer actually said this in court. How does that lawyer even sleep at night trying to get this killer out to the public sooner? The reason why Antonio killed his great-grandmother was for money. It's so sickening. I think the punishment wasn't cruel enough, but that's just my opinion. Moving into number 3, we have an 18-year-old who was sentenced to 20 years in state prison for using a dating app to set up a robbery that resulted in a shootout. In the footage I'm about to play for you guys, I really feel bad for this mother who is just so hurt. Once she finds out her daughter was charged and sentenced to 20 years in prison, she totally loses it. She freaks out, and then the teenager starts to freak out as well. This one is really sad. Watch.
20 years in state prison.
The teenager was then quickly taken out of the courtroom by police officers, and the mother was just left there to cry. She was so heartbroken, and I would be as well if I found out that my kid committed a robbery and guns were used and then they were sentenced to 20 years in prison. It's like you lost them. I'm not sure if she is even able to get out of prison sooner, but she did use a deadly weapon during this robbery that could have resulted in someone losing their life. Do you guys think that 20 years was, maybe too harsh of a punishment for this crime? All right, number 2.
Saying pull the trigger that killed your son, masturbates to memory. All of you.
Sentencing Lane to life in prison, Judge David Fury said he lacked remorse and had feigned mental illness.
So this guy might look familiar to you guys, and to be honest with you, I don't care if this guy gets left in prison and forgotten about for the rest of his life. So who you just saw was TJ Lane, the teenager who was in front of a judge for sentencing for a school shooting in Ohio back in 2012. TJ was 17 years old when he shot and killed 3 students and injured another 3. Although TJ was a minor at the time of the attack during the sentencing, he was tried as an adult and he was given 3 life sentences in prison without parole. Well, just a few years after the attack, he was actually able to escape prison. This was just 8 days before his birthday, and he escaped from Allen Correctional Institution in Ohio along with 2 other inmates. He was able to escape using a makeshift ladder. They used it to scale down a fence during recreation hours. One of the men was quickly recaptured, but TJ and another man who was serving a 12-year sentence for aggravated robbery and burglary and kidnapping remained at large. Police conducted a nationwide search and told nearby residents to lock their doors. Eventually, both men were captured, and TJ was then put into a small cell for 23 hours a day, and he stayed there until he awaited for his transfer to a maximum security prison. A prison where hopefully you can't make a makeshift ladder and escape again. And finally, at number 1, we have this scary freakout from a California teenager who was begging to not go to prison. That was 18-year-old Fernando Elgato, who was accused of rape. He denies all claims, and he was freaking out when he was being sentenced because he was actually afraid of going back to prison. For some reason, he thought that if he fought back, he would somehow be released.
Scared of returning to jail, 18-year-old...
I feel really bad for this kid because if he actually didn't do it, he just appeared in front of a judge, he got sentenced, and now he's going back to prison where I don't really know what happens there. I can only imagine.
Starting us off with number 10 are Catherine and Curtis Fairchild Jones. In Melbourne, 1999, at 13 and 12 years old, Catherine and Curtis became the youngest people ever charged as adults for first-degree murder. The two shot their father's girlfriend Sonia and had plans to murder their father as well and another male relative for sexually molesting them. As soon as they had shot her, they realized what a huge mistake they'd made and they ran to their neighbor's house and said it was an accident. Even after evidence of abuse was found, no one did anything. No one believed the two were being abused and they were sent to jail. During their trial, they never brought up the abuse. Nothing about what they had endured was even mentioned. I mean, the man who was abusing them was convicted of assaulting his girlfriend's daughter years prior. Why was this not brought up by their defense during their trial? I have no idea. Then the justice system failed them and they pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and were sentenced to 18 years and probation for life. They were both released in 2015 at 29 and 30 years old. That's basically your whole prime part of life all spent in jail.
Now at number 9, we have a girl who freaked out so bad she started hiccuping. Like it was just uncontrollably. And I remember one time I hiccuped for like 6 months straight. It was really weird. So
the parents testified has a history of being someone who can be manipulated.
So this teenager, Jennifer Mee, was being tried in court for a murder charge and she just couldn't keep calm. She was freaking out while being handcuffed. Jennifer Mee actually became famous after that video, and after years she finally talked about that viral video.
What happened to that sweet 15-year-old girl that we first met?
I couldn't even tell you. I got cased up with the wrong crowd of people, really. Unfortunately, when I started experimenting with drugs, I just felt like I was invincible to everything.
Now she will be facing the rest of her life in prison, and she may not have the opportunity to ever leave. During the interview, she said that she thinks she deserves about 20 years, but not more than that.
Personally, I feel would be fair is at least 20 years. I do, because yes, somebody's life was taken, somebody's loved one, somebody's child.
Your attorney has said now there's less than a 1% to 2% chance of you ever getting out of here. How do you hold on to hope?
I can't put nothing past God, but I've been locked up since I was 19. I can't stop fighting. I have a family that wants me home.
Next up, at number 8, we have 17-year-old Racelyn Martin, who pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and this is after he killed his 63-year-old grandfather with a hatchet. Is this real life right now? He was sentenced to life in prison, and during court, Martin was freaking out. And this guy was just shaking. He was so scared. He was terrified of what was going to happen to him. Well, what else do you think is going to happen to you? Yeah, buddy, you're going to be in prison for the rest of your life. Okay, let's watch that again, but I'll slow it down a bit for you guys. It must be a very difficult case because both of his parents testified against him.
And appeared to be listening intently to testimony, occasionally nervously looking down. Tonight we heard testimony from both parents.
Moving into number 7, we have the youngest on our list, 13-year-old Kashan Man, who became the youngest person who committed murder in Kent County. Kashan killed his mom's boyfriend. So after Kashan's mom actually tried defending her 13-year-old son, the victim's family were outraged and chaos pursued in the courtroom.
That angered relatives of the victim, Jermel Stokes, leading to a scuffle.
The mom was saying that she actually found out her boyfriend was abusing her son and the murder was justified. I don't think that any murder can be justified, and also the mom was fighting for her son to not be tried as an adult. This is a crazy situation because you have this young kid who is abused, and now because of poor decisions, he's going to prison for the rest of his life.
This is a child. Yes, he may have committed an adult crime.
The judge was about to sentence her son, Kashan Man, for second-degree murder.
But obviously, after it all comes out, he was treated in ways that I had no clue of. So we can't say that, oh, he was never mistreated.
Moving into number 6.
Court physically shaking throughout the hearing. Then the sentence was read.
So therefore, it's the sentence of this court, Mr. Rose,
that you be sentenced to serve a minimum of 10 years to a maximum of 15 years in prison.
So that was Stacy Rose Jr., who just couldn't believe his sentencing. Rose Jr. was caught up in a fight when 49-year-old Briscoe came outside to break up the fight. He was a father of one of the teenagers. He's also a father of 5 and a grandfather to 3 grandchildren. Rose Jr. fled the scene on foot through the neighborhood, but eyewitnesses was able to tell the police who the killer was, and he was quickly arrested. Outside of the courthouse, Rose Jr.'s mom was freaking out because she couldn't believe his sentencing.
So my son wasn't a drug dealer. They went over there and stole them pills out of his car.
Rose Jr. was very shocked to know he was sentenced for so long. He claims it was an accident. This teen was just shaking like crazy in the courtroom, and he was just crying right after his sentence. Alright, so at number 5, we have someone who isn't even a teenager yet, and she was freaking out. She appeared on an episode of Beyond Scared Straight. I love that show, and I love how they're such bad kids, they get reformed, and then they turn out to be okay kids. But the episode I'm going to show you guys is about a wannabe 12-year-old girl who thinks she's tough. Her name's Ashanti. And this girl was on track, to serve the rest of her life behind bars because she just seems so violent. Who knows what this little girl is capable of as she gets older.
I'm Ashanti, I'm 12, I like fighting, I threaten people, and I'm in the squad.
She's kind of speaking too gangster for me. I can barely hear what the heck she is saying, but from what I heard, she's not afraid of nobody. Well, until she was taken to a prison to see what her life was going to be like if she didn't change. Well, what you're about to see is someone who I've never seen be so afraid of anything before. This girl is just freaking out and just losing her mind, and she's like squealing, I think.
We're getting closer and closer. They are gonna love that hair back here, buddy. Here we go. Ain't no time to cry now, sister. Ain't no time to cry.
Okay, what the heck is even happening? She's just in panic mode. I'm not sure how tough this girl really is. Her tough act just seems to be fake. She's not ready for the real prison world. If she was, she wouldn't be acting like that. Number 4, we have teenager Roxana Silvorsky, who was emotionally freaking out in court while she was being sentenced. Silvorsky pleaded guilty to plotting to kill her family. Is this real life right now? Imagine being her family member and you just found out that this teenager, your daughter, your sister, she was plotting on murdering you. Well, luckily she was brought in by the police before anything bad happened, and now she is serving a very long time in a women's correctional facility. Number 3, I actually just wanted to show you guys quickly a different perspective, the opposite of someone freaking out in court, and he seemed to have zero emotions while he was being sentenced. I mean, watch this.
It is hereby ordered that you be committed to the Department of Youth Services until the age of 21, and furthermore committed to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Cedar Junction.
This kid was just sentenced to over 40 years in prison, and he didn't even flinch. He was just 14 years old when he stabbed his teacher to death. I mean, I don't know, is he freaking out inside? Number 2.
That's an extreme recklessness, and that's intent, that's maliciousness, that's a definition of malice.
So that was 17-year-old Jacob Morgan from Rock Hill, South Carolina. He found himself in court after he was charged with arson and murder connected with his 14-year-old brother's death. Prosecutors claim that Morgan maliciously and intentionally started a fire. Morgan was so shocked when he was sentenced.
So therefore, I am going to find that there is probable cause to charge the individual with the found over 4 years.
His life just flashed before his eyes. He didn't think that he would get such a long sentence. He was charged for manslaughter, so he received 10 years for that, and another 15 years for arson, which to me it kind of doesn't make sense because, well, let's think about it for a sec. 10 years for killing someone, 15 years for setting a house on fire. I mean, I don't know. Finally, number 1.
See you, ladies and gentlemen.
I count at least 20 officers in that room to retain 19-year-old Dexter Johnson. He was sentenced to death, so yeah, he was pretty pissed off.
Johnson, the jury has found you guilty of capital murder. In accordance with the laws of the state of Texas, this court hereby assesses your punishment of death. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is going to complete your jury service. I'm going to meet you in the jury room.
So Johnson sat down and he kind of let it sit in for a few seconds when he was sentenced, and just a few minutes went by when he realized that there's nothing else to lose. This guy just loses his cool and he just freaks out into a rage. I'm not sure if you guys noticed, but the woman in front just booked into the floor as if there was like a gunman in the room. She was just super scared. It seemed to come out of nowhere, and luckily there were so many police officers around, because you never know what else Johnson would be capable of doing. I mean, he's already capable of murder, so what's one more murder to his rap sheet? Dark list. In at number 10, we have Brian Lee Draper. Let me take you guys back to the night of September 22nd, 2006, where Brian Draper and his accomplice brutally murdered their classmate Cassie Stoddard for no apparent reason. They were hanging out with Cassie and her boyfriend on the night that Brian and his accomplice said that they were going to the theater to see a movie. As it turns out, they never went to the theater. They were hiding in the house waiting for Cassie's boyfriend to leave so that they can kill her. They turned the electricity off and stabbed the poor girl 30 times. During their trial, the two of them confessed to filming the entire plan. So here's a short clip of the two of them driving away from the scene of the crime.
I just killed Cassie. We just left her house. This is not a joke. I stabbed her in the throat and I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie.
How sick and morbid is this? It just seems like they're so proud of what they've just done. Well, they were quickly picked up and interrogated, and they were arrested because their fake alibi fell through, and they were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Keep in mind that they were only 16 when they decided to brutally murder their friend. John Silva stabs his way up.
Coming in at number 9 is Atif Rafe and Sebastian Burns. Funnily enough, I knew about this case beforehand because it's a very good Netflix docuseries about different crimes, and it's called The Confession Tapes, and this was that first case it actually explored. Highly recommend, but anyway, in Bellevue back in 1994, Atif and his best friend Sebastian came back to Atif's family's house for the holidays. All was well until the boys came back from a long night out to discover Atif's parents and sister brutally murdered and his house a complete mess. After their murder, Atif inherited basically everything his parents had, buying a new car, living a new lifestyle, and seemingly not mourning the loss of his family at all. Police in both the US and Canada suspected the two boys of killing his family in order to get their money. They slandered them in the news like there was no tomorrow, branded them as murderers, and then using the Mr. Big technique to extract a confession from them. This technique is actually illegal in the US, but legal in Canada where it was done. It involves undercover cops gaining the suspect's trust by involving them in illegal activities and then getting them to confess. Even with multiple alibis and no physical evidence, the undercover cop kept probing Burns to confess and he would make it all go away. I'm assuming in the hopes of making his life go back to normal, Burns did confess, and later on so did Atif, even though their stories were completely different. Both were found guilty in 2004 of a triple murder and were both sentenced to 3 life sentences each, even though they've been in prison for the past 20 years. At first I thought, how could anyone murder their parents, but after doing this video and seeing how many people actually did, I was like, wow, this is a thing. This actually happens. At number 8 is Joshua Smith. Now in February of 2012, 14-year-old Joshua broke into his stepfather Chico's room and stole his shotgun. Right after that, he started shooting things around the house, and Chico and his daughter were able to escape his rampage by breaking a window and climbing through. Joshua's mother, Tamika Robertson, was sleeping on the sofa when he shot her around 12 to 14 times at close range. And why did he do this, you may be wondering? Because his mother was being a mother. That's right, Joshua started hanging out with the wrong crowd and wanted to join a gang, do drugs, pop pills. He started coming home at ridiculous hours, so Tamiko gave him a curfew and told him to stop hanging out with these people, and that's what triggered him. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and will be in jail for anywhere from 30 to 50 years. Filling our number 7 slot now is Evan Miller. Now Evan's life was hard enough. By the time he turned 14 in 2003, he'd been in and out of foster care due to his stepfather continuously beating him and his mother abusing drugs and alcohol. One day he was hanging out with his friends and his neighbor Cannon, who also happened to be one of his mum's drug dealers. After spending most of the night drinking and smoking weed, Evan and his friends attempted to rob Cannon after beating him. Evan beat him with a baseball bat and then set his trailer on fire, and he later died from his injuries and smoke inhalation. When brought to trial, his friend was offered life with a chance of parole if he testified against Evan, which obviously he did. In 2006, Evan was sentenced to life without parole, and now at 28 years old, he may have a chance at a retrial, but for now he's still very much in prison. Now at number 6 is Jacob P. Ind. Back in 1992, when Jacob was 15 years old, he killed his mum and his stepdad. After enduring years of physical and emotional abuse, Jacob hired another older teen to help him murder his parents. Then, in the morning of December 17th, they went to their bedroom where they were fast asleep and attacked them for 5 whole minutes using various gruesome methods, stabbing them, spraying their faces with bear mace, and shooting them as well. He never testified during his first trial since his defense told him he would pack up and leave if he tried, so he was sentenced to life without parole. After spending 25 years in prison, he was finally granted a retrial and the right to testify back in August of 2018. And his retrial hasn't happened yet, so we don't know the conviction as of yet. Coming at number 5 is Diana Ortiz. Diana was 18 years old when she moved to New York in 1983 to flee an abusive relationship, and that's where she eventually met her new boyfriend, who was double her age. The man introduced her to drugs like heroin, LSD, and cocaine, and convinced that the only way to sustain both their habits was to stage a robbery. Note, not a murder, just a robbery. The plan was sorted. She would pose as a prostitute in a parking lot, wait for someone to approach her, and then her boyfriend and some friends would rob him. However, on the actual day, the victim that pulled up to her started fighting with the men, and a brawl ensued and he was eventually shot. While they all ran off in separate directions, what they had no clue about was that the customer was actually an off-duty police officer, and he actually died a few days later. Diana turned herself in and was convicted of felony murder and was sentenced to 17 years to life. And after 22.5 years in prison, she finally went on parole. Imagine 22.5 years in prison. I'm only 21 right now, and I feel like I lived a long life. That's my life and then some, all in prison. I can't even imagine that. At number 4 is Quantel Lotz. Now Lotz, like a lot of other kids on this list, had a troubled upbringing. His dad, mum, stepmom, uncles, aunts, basically everyone around him was addicted to cocaine, even getting high on it while he was still in the room at a very young age. He'd seen his uncle get shot multiple times because of drugs, and he himself was beaten on a regular basis. By 14, he used to have bouts of getting very angry, then crying uncontrollably, and then amnesia about what happened. In 1999, he was play fighting with his stepbrother Michael. It started off innocently, as it always does. Michael sent a blow dart his way, Lotz fired back with a toy bow and arrow, but then it turned very ugly and escalated into a proper fight. It ended with Lotz stabbing Michael a few times and then ultimately killing him. He literally doesn't remember the incident whatsoever. He just remembers being told the next day that his brother was dead, and he was the reason. He was tried as an adult, not a juvenile, and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Even though at 14 the state of Missouri thinks you're too young to legally get married, leave school, donate blood, get a tattoo without parental approval, yet you're old enough to be tried as an adult and then put away in jail forever. Filling in on number 3 slot is John Catus. Back in 2009, John was 16 at the time when he put up an ad on Craigslist offering sexual services in exchange for money, and the very popular ABC reporter George Webber replied to his ad. When they finally met up for this kinky hookup, if we can call it that, John claimed that George pulled a knife on him, and as self-defense he stabbed George 50 times. Mind you, George was bound and being choked when this happens, so I don't know how he could have even pulled a knife out to begin with. And if it was really self-defense, why 50 times? Surely someone's dead after maybe a few, or at least injured enough for you to escape the situation. During his hearings and his confession tapes, you can see him literally wink and smile throughout. At 18 years old, John was found guilty and was sentenced to 25 years to life, and at 28 years old, he's still in prison today. Now at number 2 is Ashley Jones. Ashley was a problem child raised by problematic parents. His stepdad used to daughter, and her mum was a drug addict, so it appeared to be a blessing when her grandparents agreed to take in her and her sister. I don't know if they agreed to take her in or her parents kicked her out, since she stabbed both her dad and her pregnant mum a year beforehand. Luckily neither died. A year later, at 14 years old, she was disobeying her grandparents more and more, and she was dating a boy they didn't approve of. The couple hatched a plan, and she helped her boyfriend commit a series of murders. First, they killed her granddad, shooting him twice in the face and then stabbing him to death. Then her aunt, who they shot in her sleep, and then set them both on fire. They also attacked her grandmom, who also got burned on the face, stabbed in the chest and jaw, and shot in the shoulder. Luckily, she survived, and she also tried to kill her own 10-year-old sister by stabbing her 14 times, but she also survived, thank God. Now at 24 years old, she's still in prison serving out her life sentence. And finally, at number 1 is Erin Caffey. Way back in March of 2008, Erin started dating a boy called Charlie Wilkinson. Story seems pretty kosher so far. After meeting Charlie, her parents felt like there was something off about him but didn't worry too much, but then Erin started to change. Her interests changed, her demeanor changed, and her parents thought Charlie was a bad influence and wanted them to break up. So what do any desperate teenagers do in that situation? Hatch a plan. Charlie and his friend Wade went into Erin's house while she waited in the car with Wade's girlfriend and shot Erin's mother Penny, whilst also nearly decapitating her with a katana. They then shot her youngest brother Matthew in the head, while James and his friend both took turns stabbing her other brother Tyler. As if that wasn't bad enough, they then set the house on fire and it was completely ruined. Erin's father was also really badly injured. They shot him nearly 11 times whilst they killed Penny, but luckily he survived and was able to escape the house before it completely went up in flames. I mean, I don't know how lucky that is considering he survived his wife and kids and his remaining child is in jail, but it's still a good sign. Initially, no one suspected Erin, but during Charlie and Wade's questionings, they both said that the murders were Erin's idea. At 17 years old, Erin pleaded guilty to murder, as did Charlie, and they were both given 2 consecutive life sentences plus 25 years.
In at number 10, we have George Parrott, who was just 17 years old when he was arrested, and soon after he was convicted of and an assault that took place back in 1987. Well, Georgia spent 30 years in prison after it was deemed that he was actually wrongly convicted due to bogus FBI evidence.
He was convicted mainly on an FBI agent's testimony about a microscopic hair found in connection with the rape, but a judge found that evidence to be flawed and released Parrott on personal recognizance Wednesday.
This is why the justice system is just so messed up. A lot of times police officers or FBI agents are convinced, they're so convinced that this is the guy that committed the crime. So what they do is they do anything they can to get a conviction, to put this guy behind prison and to do it fast. Well, we have witnessed in the past them giving false statements, tampering with evidence, and a lot of times we have witnessed FBI agents and police officers get it wrong. They convicted the wrong person.
Did you ever lose hope after all those years? No, absolutely. Of course, I've been in 30 years. A crime I didn't commit. Of course, I lost hope.
For people who may not have hope, what do you want them to know? It's got to pull out.
Don't give up. Don't give up. That's for sure. Don't give up.
Onto this list at number 9. He was only 15 years old when he was convicted of first-degree murder after he strangled a 12-year-old boy and dumped his body in a septic tank. He was convicted of first-degree murder, and when he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, he didn't show any emotions. If he was an adult, he could have faced the death penalty because he even admitted to kidnapping his friend, forcing him to go to the woods, and then suffocating him to death. What a brutal crime. Even though he admitted to doing all of that, he never explained why he did it. So yeah, this guy sounds like a serial killer in the making. The police even found a note at the scene of the crime, and on that note it said, list to prepare Jerry, and on the note it said, strip to underwear, tie hands, gag and cover eyes. And like I said, he's a serial killer in the making, so maybe it's a good thing that he's gonna be behind bars for the rest of his life, because the world's gonna be a much safer place. Number 8 takes us to Joshua Phillips. He was convicted of life in prison without parole back in July of 1999, and that's after he murdered his 8-year-old neighbor when he was just 14 years old. He strangled, bludgeoned, and stabbed Maddie Clifton to death. He stuffed her lifeless body underneath his waterbed, but she wouldn't stay hidden for long. Joshua's mother came into his room days after the murder and found the dead body, which led him to confess to this murder. He said that they were playing basketball outside and he accidentally hit her on the head with his bat. He said he panicked and then killed her because he was scared of what his father would think. And I don't know, it seems like you killed her because you are a psychopath. This was no accident. Here's a clip of Joshua that was filmed 1 decade after the murder.
I kept going like, all right, well, maybe I did deserve to be here. Maybe I deserve to do as much time. Maybe I deserve to die in prison. And but I always usually come back with the thought that I can't look at it like that, you know, and that doing that is just a cop-out and faking it. You know, you're just saying screw it, and why would I try to learn anything? Why would I try to improve myself? Why would I try to do anything to help anybody if I'm just gonna lay down and just die in here, you know?
Even though he might seem like he has changed, I feel like he is a textbook psychopath who knows the right things to say in order to look like a victim. The youngest American citizen to be sentenced to life in prison make their way onto this list at number 7. I'm talking about the notorious Lionel Tate, who was just 13 years old when he was convicted of first-degree murder.
To be the case, incarceration for your natural life. The now 14-year-old Lionel Tate was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Back on July 28, 1999, Lionel was left alone with a 6-year-old friend in the basement. The two of them were downstairs playing when all of a sudden Lionel came upstairs 45 minutes later to tell his mother that the little girl wasn't breathing. He said that they were wrestling and he had her in a headlock and then smashed her against the table. An autopsy revealed that he had stomped on her so hard that he actually lacerated her liver, fractured her skull and ribs, and her brain was very swollen. During the trial, the prosecution said that these injuries can be compared to falling from a 3-story building. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and the judge said that the acts of Lionel Tate were not the playful acts of a child. The acts of Lionel Tate were cold, callous, and cruel. Moving on to number 6, let's talk about Courvoisier Sims.
A judge sentenced 17-year-old Courvoisier Sims to 70 to 120 years in prison after pleading guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and use of a weapon in their deaths.
Alright, I have to ask, is this real life right now? 70 to 120 years? I know that sounds insane, but I think the sentencing, it kind of fits this crime. He was only 15 years old when he shot 2 teenagers, ages 17 and 18 years old, while he was attempting to buy a gun off of them. It was decided that he'd be tried as an adult because he was involved in armed robberies and 2 homicides. Oh, and he was on probation during the murders for other crimes that he committed in the past. What? So yeah, I think it's safe to say that he is a repeat offender and he will most likely die behind bars because I don't think a parole board will ever grant him probation. At least I'm really hoping they don't. Rodrigo Caballero crawls onto this dark list at number 5. Rodrigo Caballero was sentenced to 110 years in prison when he was 16 years old, and he didn't even kill anyone. So how is this possible? Well, the 16-year-old fired several gunshots at 3 other teenagers, where one of them suffered from a non-fatal but serious injury. He was convicted of 3 counts of attempted murder, and each of those charges, they come with a minimum 15-year to life. And the judge also handed him special enhancements onto his sentencing for firing a gun belonging to a gang and greatly injuring one of the victims. When you add up all of these charges, you get 110 years. So technically, he isn't sentenced to life to prison without parole. He will be eligible for parole when he's 126 years old, but most likely he is going to be dead before he makes it to his parole hearing. Up next, number 4, we have Gregory Brooks. He was 19 years old when he pleaded guilty to abducting and killing the parents of a former talk show host. Gregory Brooks and his accomplices beat them, stole $50, a rifle, jewelry, and other items, then they locked the couple in a closet. Later, one of the accomplices said he would return to the house to finish them off. The judge gave him 60 years for each of the 2 counts of murder and robbery charges, and just moments after he was sentenced to 120 years, his father told reporters that despite his son having a good, supportive upbringing, he was influenced by gang members with negative motives. Could you imagine being sentenced to 120 years in maximum prison at such a young age? Your whole life. is just gone. He will literally die and rot behind bars for the rest of his life because of one stupid night. Moving up this list, at number 3, we're talking about Eddie Devine. This case is pretty intense, so prepare yourselves. He was only 13 years old at the time when him and his friend forced a woman into a car where they drove around for hours while they tortured and violated her with an ice pick. Thankfully, the woman was able to escape when the teenager stopped for gas, but she will be scarred for the rest of her life. Eddie Devine pleaded guilty to 2 counts of armed carjacking, 3 counts of armed robbery, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 2 counts of battery. This kid isn't even old enough to go around the block by himself, and he's already committing all of these horrible crimes. To make things even worse, he told police that he was armed with a knife and he threatened to kill the woman before they stole her SUV. I'm pretty sure when I was 13, I was collecting Pokemon cards. I wasn't going around committing all these crimes. Eddie Devine did not get off lightly. He was sentenced to a total of 130 years in prison. Kenneth Young sneaks onto this list at number 2. He was only 14 years old when his mother's drug dealer forced him to get involved in a series of armed robberies. During one heist, Kenneth was caught, convicted, and sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences. So basically, he was sentenced to be thrown behind bars without ever having a chance of being released, and he didn't even injure or kill anyone. Let's hear from Kenneth Young.
Kenneth Young. First and foremost, Your Honor, I want to take the time out to say I take full responsibility for my actions and my role in these crimes. I have lived with regret every day as a civilized human being for these crimes. I have been incarcerated for 11 years, and I have taken advantage of every opportunity available for me in prison to better myself.
He was coerced into committing these crimes, and he was at such a young and impressionable age. I don't think he should have gotten this harsh sentence. Because of this young age and the severity of the sentence, he spent most of his time in solitary confinement until he reached 18 years old, where he was then transferred to an adult prison where he will grow old and die. And now at the top of our list, we've talked about him before. We actually did a whole docu-series of him. If you guys want to check that out, you guys can click right over here. It's called The Prison Life of Travion Blunt. Well, Travion Blunt makes it onto our list at number 1 for this video. Travion Blunt was 15 years old when he robbed a party with 2 older gang members. Travion didn't hurt anyone, but he was found guilty of 49 counts, and eventually he was sentenced to 6 life sentences and an additional 118 years in prison. He knew he would be spending a few years in prison. He didn't expect to die in there. This has to be one of the harshest punishments in America for a teenager who didn't even commit homicide. Oh, and his accomplice, well, they only served 10 to 13 years in prison. I don't understand how this was even possible. Out of the 3 of them, Travion was the least involved, but he got the most time. After spending some time in prison, Travion finally got a glimpse of hope.
Received much lighter sentences.
Governor Bob McDonnell reduced Blunt's sentence to 40 years, and today, Governor Terry McAuliffe cut it down to 14.
I mean, what the heck? His sentence was reduced from 6 life sentences plus 118 years to just 14 years. This makes me wonder what the heck was wrong with the original judge. I think his license should be put into question because I have no idea what was going through his mind. Maybe he was severely power tripping that day. He was just so pissed off. He's like, I'm giving you life, plus life, plus life, plus life, plus life, and plus life, and if that's not enough, plus 118 years, just in case.